What is going on, my friends? Welcome back to another episode. This is the 11th now in the series of the winter build, right? But I guess that's how projects end up going. It's almost the end of summer now, so I guess winter to winter is really what we mean when we say winter build. But if you guys are just tuning in, on the last episode, I was able to get the engine back into the engine bay. So really, as they say, it's all downhill from here. We're just going to be buttoning up all the last little bits and loose connections, making all the last bits of lines and hoses and whatnot for the coolers and the fuel and the catch can and all that other crap. Working on getting the suspension back together. We're going to get the drive line, the drive shaft bolted back up to the transmission, and really just kind of start getting it back to getting ready to be back on the ground. Now, when I address the fuel system, that's going to be a completely different episode because that's going to be a little bit more in depth. But this is really probably just going to end up being more of a bunch of compilations of me just hooking stuff back up. So let's get started. All right, now before we just jump into getting to work, let's take a quick minute and do a recap of everything that we've done and what I've had to put back in since the engine bay has been reinstalled. Because as you kind of look at the overall width and girth of this thing, it is far too fat to fit between those frame rails. So you saw that I had to remove the turbo, so I replaced the turbo, hooked all the lines back up. You guys saw that when it was out of the car, so nothing really new there. Went ahead and reconnected the throttle cable bracket and reconnected the cable as well. And then I've also reconnected the heater core lines, so that's all taken care of. So on this episode, what we're going to be really focusing on, again, is just kind of buttoning up some of the last little bits. Now, I did reconnect all those leads from the harness that we saw before, so that's all plugged in. I've reinstalled the radiator. This is a newer Mishimoto. I used to have an older style Koyo, so got a new one for this. Hoses have already been reconnected, so now we could go ahead and hook up the new clutch fan as well as the GK Tech fan itself. And we're going to be making a lot of lines on this one. We're going to finish up the oil feed line from the filter to the rail here. We're going to make our catch can lines. We're going to finish up the oil cooler lines down to this guy. We're going to relocate our reservoir because that used to sit right up in there, but as you could tell, there's no more room with the turbo mounted there. So we're going to go ahead and move this guy over to here. So I'll probably run a bracket off of that mounting hole there. This will kind of sit up in the corner, and we should have plenty of room to run the lines to both the pump as well as the cooler up front. So I'll go ahead and get that mounted. I can run a couple of lines, but I'm waiting for a larger line for that guy, and I also have to cut the hard line coming from the rack that goes to the reservoir because, well, this is too short if we're going to mount that there, so we got to extend it. We will also be connecting the boost control solenoid up in this corner here. So once the bracket comes in, I can mount it under there, and we'll run all of our lines to both the wastegate and the compressor housing right there. Yeah, so we're gonna just kind of button those lines up top. Then we're gonna move under the car and we're gonna reconnect our passenger side suspension. Now, I've already done the driver's side, but to save the trouble of showing you guys the exact same thing but twice, we're only gonna do the passenger side because installing the passenger side axle is a little bit different as we have to bolt this guy up versus just popping the spline portion of the shaft into the front diff. So we'll go ahead and get this reconnected. Then we'll get down underneath to the transmission and reinstall those 3 40mm bolts that I had to finish up that I couldn't get to because the car was down on a dolly and I couldn't reach them. So now that it's installed, we'll go ahead and button those guys up. First item we're going to work on is the new clutch fan with the GK Tech cooling fan itself. So that's going to go onto the pulley. Now I do have the OEM shroud, but the previous owner had kind of hacked it up, and my OEM shroud, some of the fan blades looked like they had been like melted from contacting this thing. So I'll probably end up just ordering a new one or fab one up. But for now, we'll go ahead and get this guy bolted onto the pulley, and then we'll move along. So if we look down here at the water pump, you see the 4 studs. Now I did put these nuts on temporarily when I was tightening everything down, just so the pulley itself stayed square on the water pump. But now we'll go ahead and remove all these nuts. We'll get the fan put in place, and then we'll go ahead and tighten it down. All right, so the fan is reconnected. Now we're gonna go ahead and start doing all the lines. I figured it'd probably be easier instead of just stopping on every single one, we're just gonna do a compilation. So sit tight, it's time to run through some hose. Just to kind of give you an overview, it's coming out of the sandwich adapter, the Grady adapter there. Runs through, runs past the radiator there. And then we got them all mounted up. So yeah, I apologize. It took a bunch of still images of me cutting the lines and then making them, which was actually a bit of a headache because I had to do it right here instead of over on the bench. So part of me is glad that I didn't capture it because it was kind of a pain in the butt. But these guys are all connected here, so let's keep working. It's time to start working on the passenger side of the bay, and we're gonna get the reservoir moved over to this location. So if you look down there, you can see that mounting hole right there. And we're gonna be going up to those 2 points. So we'll make a little L bracket and then make some marks as far as where those are gonna be located. Now I have seen some people cut off that tab, but it basically just kind of tucks right back in there. So if you ever wanna reuse it or sell it, you're not gonna be down that tab. So again, just kind of sits like that, and we'll make a little bracket out of this 1/8 inch by 3/4 flat stock. So we'll make a bend on one side, get it mounted to the bolt location there, and then we'll run it up and make some marks as far as where that's going to sit. So there's the little relocation bracket. I'll go ahead and tighten stuff down. Still a little loose just so I could figure out exactly where it's going to sit. And then obviously once we hook the lines up, that thing's not going to go anywhere. So I'll go ahead and take this bracket back out, paint it black. Once it dries, we'll really tighten everything down. That one will be good. And then I can start running some of the lines for the reservoir as well as the cooler. So while the bracket's drying, we could go ahead and start working on the power steering cooler lines coming off of the pump. So this is basically going to replace the existing OEM cooler that went there. And if you deleted your Hicus, you basically loop the line around that ran back over to this side. So that way the rear portion of the vanes is basically pumping the fluid through the cooler. So go ahead and measure the line coming out of this. Now this right here is a 16mm to 6AN adapter. And then this will thread on, this will come around and go over to this farthest port. And then this one will come out and go into the reservoir. So we'll go ahead and start getting that line fitted. And here is the completed reservoir. So the little angle bracket that we made, painted black, everything's in there pretty tight. And then again, once we connect these lines, it's really not going to move. So once these lines come in, I'll go ahead and finish this up. But for now, that's going to be it. I got the power steering cooler line ran to the pump, and then we'll just plug this guy in here. We'll tuck it back in there. There we go. Getting there. On to the next project. Well, the bracket for the boost control solenoid came in, so I went ahead and mounted that up here in this free space by the wiper motor. I didn't film me installing it because you have to fish your hand up past underneath the fender in this like little passage on this side that's separate from where the wire harness goes back in the cabin. And yeah, that kind of took a little bit. But that's already mounted on there. So now we're going to go ahead and run the lines, and then I'll go ahead and wire it in a little bit later once we run the harness back inside. So if we look at the solenoid from this angle on the far right, that's port number 1. Port number 1, we're going to route it around, and that's going to come over here to our compressor housing fitting. Port number 2 on the left-hand side, that's going to come over here to the top portion of the wastegate. And then number 3 in the middle, that's going to go to the lower portion. So if you look it up on TurboSmart, they'll tell you that routing it like that will give you the maximum boost pressure out of your system. So let's go make some lines. All right, guys, bit of an update on the power steering lines. So I finally got the larger hose. So the size braided hose that fits onto this neck from the pump to the reservoir is a -16. I originally ordered a -12, and that was just a bit too small. So the -16 actually fits on there pretty snug. So I'm gonna get some T-bolt clamps to secure both of those connections. Then I just have to finish up the line going from the reservoir to the power steering cooler. Now this line, I was originally planning on running -6 for everything. So this is a -6 coming out of the pump, going down into the cooler, and then goes back into the reservoir at this fitting here. So I measured everything, and it measures out to a -6, but it is like a micron larger, and it'll fit just barely over it, but I can't really get it to fully slide up and seat. So I end up trying to fit a -8 on there, and the -8 fits perfectly. So it's not too loose. It does take some effort to slide up and get in place, and you can see that there really isn't a gap between the hose and the tube going into the reservoir. So I'm gonna go ahead and clamp that guy on there. We'll make our cut line, and the -8 line is gonna be really, really short. You can see it's basically poking out of the radiator right there and just has to go right there. So it's only gonna be a couple inches. At first I was kind of concerned having to use the -8 compared to the -6, and I have part of the fittings to change all of this to a -8, so I don't know. I still might end up changing that to a -8, but for now I know that this is what's gonna fit, so I'll go ahead and get this side buttoned up. This should be plenty good for now. I mean, that's only like 4 inches of tubing, and the ID difference isn't really going to make that big of a pressure issue. So we'll go ahead and start working on these guys, and we'll finish it up. With these lines all finished up, the last thing that we have to do is make the new line that goes from the reservoir to the return hard line. But being that the hardline adapter fitting that I got isn't really going to fit on that line, like the OD is correct, but it is just so tight, the collet's not going to slide on there. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and completely remove that hard line from the rack and make a brand new one. I have some of the fittings already that go in the rack, but I ended up ordering some new ones just so I could run the -8 line to the reservoir. So for the time being, we're going to put this on hold, and we'll go ahead and finish up the suspension. So on the passenger side, I chose to record this one because getting the axle reattached is a little bit different. On this one, we use 6 bolts to reconnect it to the front differential, or the shaft that goes through the oil pan, which goes to the front differential. Versus on the driver's side, you just have a spline feature like this, which goes through your wheel hub, but instead, it just feeds right into the front diff. So that's pretty straightforward. It just pops into place. But on this one, we'll go ahead and get this attached using the 6 bolts. Now I did order new bolts, so we have some fresh hardware, and they come with a thread locker already on the tips, as you can see there. So we'll go ahead and get these guys installed. But first we're just gonna kind of slide this down between our suspension and get it into that little channel there in our front subframe that you can see. Now I just have the wheel assembly propped up on the jack. It's not on the ball joint at all. It's just kind of resting off to the side, so I'm not going to tear the boot. So we'll just kind of slide this down and into place. And I'll go ahead and move the camera angle so we could go ahead and reinsert this side, get a nut on it so it's not going to go anywhere. Then we could bring our wheel assembly down off of the jack and go ahead and button that up. All right, so here's a better shot of where that end of the axle comes in and meets the flange for that shaft going through our oil pan and over to the front diff. So we will just get this lined up. We'll get a couple bolts put through there, get this tight, and then we'll go ahead and button back up the hub side. So now that both sides of the suspension have been put back together, we're going to get under the car and reinstall the 3 bolts for the transmission that we weren't able to do when it was on the dolly. And then we'll reconnect the prop shaft to the transmission, and then also connect the slave cylinder for the clutch. So let's go back under the car. I'm gonna hold off on doing the prop shaft just for a little bit, because I got to get the ass end back up in the air so that we can turn the prop shaft around and get to the different bolt locations. But now that all the suspension's buttoned up on both sides, we could get the wheels back on it, get it down under its own weight, back on dollies, and I could go ahead and get it away from the wall so we can start working on the fuel. But before we do that, just to get this box of wires out of the way, we're gonna go ahead and bring the rest of the pro harness up through the engine bay and just get it routed under the fender right now for the time being, and then we'll go ahead and address it on the inside a little bit later. But we'll go ahead and get that off the floor, get the wiper motor plugged in, and then route it in the fender. So there's the harness ran back to the passenger compartment. So we'll go ahead and leave this as is for now. We'll clean everything up and get everything tidied and installed a little bit later. So that is out of the way. Now we can go ahead and start getting the wheels back on. All right, guys, the car is finally back down on the ground on its own weight since, what, January, December, whenever I parked it, and really this project started when I pulled the motor. So this is a huge milestone for this project. Now I could go ahead and finish up bolting down the coilovers. I could put on the strut tower brace, and then we're gonna go ahead and get the ass end up in the air, get the car on dollies, move it away from the wall, get it positioned over on this side of the garage so I can start working on the fuel system. So let's keep going. There she is, guys, back on this side of the garage. Man, this feels really good. I purposely left the center caps off the wheel so that way now that it's back down under its own weight, I go ahead and crank down that nut for the axle on either side. And then I'm still gonna, I've already bled the brakes when I redid everything, but once the engine gets started and I have some vacuum, I'll go ahead and check the bleeding again. So when I pull the wheels off, I'll put the new cotter pin in there. So we'll go ahead and tighten these guys down and put the caps back on. With the car back down the ground, I can't help but notice the fact that there's 9+ months worth of dust and dirt built up on it. And with the engine bay looking all nice and clean, I think it's time to give the old girl a bath and bring her back up to proper conditions. So you can see how much dirt and dust has just been collecting on the cars. It's been sitting in the back of the garage. So let's get the old girl nice and cleaned up. Now that she doesn't look like the forgotten project car sitting in the corner, we're going to call this episode done. So coming up in the next one, we're going to go ahead and finish up the fuel system, button up the drive shaft, one step closer to home. Hope you guys have a good one. Thanks for watching.